Hey everyone, welcome back. It's time for another deep dive. And today we're going to be looking at a piece called A Day in the Country.
Okay.
It's a personal essay all about an author's trip to a farm called Scenic Acres. It seems like kind of a sad place, like maybe it's not doing so well.
Interesting.
Yeah, so we're going to use this one person story to think about some bigger questions about, life in rural America today.
Sure.
How we think about food and that sort of pull between living in the city and living out in the country,
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I thought maybe we could just jump right into it.
Yeah, let's get into it.
So right away, the author kind of sets up this feeling that Scenic Acres is like a place that's fading away.
Yeah, I noticed that too.
Like he even uses this phrase, a decaying sore spot, which I thought was really powerful.
Yeah, I mean, talk about imagery.
Yeah.
Right from the get-go, you really feel like this farm is struggling.
Yeah, it's almost like you're watching something kind of disappear right in front of you.
Right. And what I find so compelling is that the author uses these really specific, really vivid details to get that point across.
Exactly. Like you can practically smell the hay and hear the wind rustling through the cornfields.
Like you're right there with them.
Totally.
Yeah.
And it got me thinking, is this just one farm that's having a tough time? Or is this like a symptom of something bigger happening in rural America?
I think that's a great question. And it's one that a lot of people are asking these days. We hear a lot about the decline of small farms. But this essay really brings that issue to life.
Yeah, I mean, we see the numbers and the statistics, but this gives it like a human face.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the numbers. It's about the people, their livelihoods, their connection to the land.
It's about a whole way of life that seems to be fading away.
Right. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there are real economic forces at play here. Small farms are facing incredible pressure from large-scale agriculture.
Right. It's tough to compete.
Exactly. And then you have the challenge of attracting younger generations to farming. It's hard work, it's not always glamorous, and it doesn't always pay well.
So we've got this backdrop of economic pressure, and then we meet some of the people who work at Scenic Acres.
Yeah.
And one character that really stood out to me was this blonde cashier. She's a college student working a summer job at the farm.
Yeah, she seemed really out of place. Like she didn't really want to be there.
Exactly. The author uses this word insouciance to describe her, which honestly I had to look up.
Oh, me too. It's not exactly an everyday word.
Right. It basically means like a carefree kind of indifference or lack of concern.
Like she's just going through the motions.
Yeah. And it made me wonder, is this typical of young people today? Are they just not interested in rural life anymore?
That's a really interesting question. And I think it speaks to some of the larger demographic shifts that are happening in rural communities.
Like, what do you mean?
Well, you see a lot of young people leaving rural areas to go to college to pursue careers in cities. And that leaves a gap in these communities.
A brain drain, kind of?
Exactly. It's a challenge for farms to find workers, especially workers who are really invested in the future of agriculture.
Right. Like they need people who are passionate about farming, not just doing it for a summer job.
Exactly.
So you've got this economic pressure, you've got this generational gap, and then the author points out this really interesting contrast.
Yeah, what's that?
On the surface, Scenic Acres is this idyllic setting, rolling hills, charming barns, fresh air.
Right, like a postcard.
But underneath that picturesque facade, there's all this anxiety. The owner is worried about money. The cashier is desperate to leave. It's like the farm itself is mirroring this uncertainty about the future.
It's that classic contrast between appearances and reality.
Right. And I think it challenges this romanticized view of farm life that we often see in movies and TV shows.
Yeah, the simple life, the wholesome. Values the connection to nature.
But the reality for many farmers is much more complicated.
Absolutely. They're dealing with economic pressures, environmental challenges, a whole host of anxieties that we as consumers rarely see.
It's like we have this idealized image of rural life, but we're blind to the very real struggles that people in these communities are facing.
I think that's a really important point. And it's something that the essay really tries to get us to think about.
Yeah, it's like this disconnect between urban consumers and the realities of food production.
Exactly. We often don't see where our food comes from or who's doing the work to put it on our tables.
And I think that disconnect becomes even more apparent when the author starts describing the Mexican farm laborers.
Yeah, that was a really powerful part of the essay.
He talks about their sun-drenched faces, their grudging farm labor, and how they seem resigned to their fate.
It's clear that he feels some empathy for them. But at the same time, there's this sense that he sees them as outsiders, almost like a separate species from himself.
Right. And it made me uncomfortable. I mean,
Yeah.
It's like he's acknowledging their hard work, but he's still viewing them through this lens of otherness.
Yeah, and I think the discomfort is important. It's a reflection of our own societal discomfort with the realities of our food system.
Like, we don't want to think about the people who are picking our fruits and vegetables.
Exactly. We want our food to be cheap and plentiful, but we don't want to confront the often harsh conditions that those who produce it have to endure.
It's like we're willfully ignorant.
I think that's a fair assessment,
Yeah.
and it's something that this essay really forces us to confront.
Right. Like, we can't just enjoy those raspberries without thinking about the people who picked them.
Exactly.
And the author actually talks about feeling guilty when he eats a few raspberries in the field without paying.
Oh, yeah. I remember that part.
It's like he's suddenly aware of his role as an outsider, a consumer who benefits from the farm's bounty, but isn't really a part of its world.
It's a moment of self-awareness, I think.
Yeah.
And it speaks to this larger theme of disconnect that runs throughout the essay.
This disconnect between urban consumers and the people who grow our food.
Exactly. We're so removed from the source of our food that we often forget about the human element.
And that's a problem, isn't it?
I think so. Because it allows us to perpetuate a system that often exploits those who are most vulnerable.
It's like we're complicit in our own ignorance.
I think that's a really powerful way to put it.
So how do we change that? How do we bridge this disconnect?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
And I think the first step is awareness. We need to be conscious of where our food comes from and who's doing the work to produce it.
So it's about education.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's about making those connections between our choices at the grocery store and the lives of the people who are growing our food.
And it's about being willing to pay a fair price for food that's produced sustainably and ethically.
I agree. It's not just about getting the cheapest food possible. It's about making choices that align with our values.
Right. And I think this essay does a great job of reminding us that those choices have real consequences.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Our food choices have an impact on people's lives, on the environment, on the future of our planet.
Yeah. So maybe this deep dive is about more than just one person's experience on a farm.
Maybe it's about all of us.
Maybe it's a call to action.
I think so.
It's funny because later on the author talks about his own childhood memories of going to his uncle's farm.
Yeah.
And for him, it was like pure joy,
Yeah.
exploring the fields, playing in the barn, feeling really connected to nature. But
Yeah.
his experience at Scenic Acres is so different. It's almost like he's just a tourist.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, Scenic Acres, with its
Don't-
pick your own fruit and the whole, curated atmosphere.
Right.
It's a classic example of agritourism.
Agritourism.
Yeah, basically farms marketing themselves as like leisure destinations for city folks.
So instead of being a place that produces food, they're more like entertainment venues.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, you have hay rides, corn mazes,
Yeah.
petting zoos, all these activities that let people, experience a little bit of farm life,
Right.
but without actually, getting their hands dirty.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a sanitized version of farm life.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it can be a good thing. It gets people out of the city, exposes them to nature, maybe teaches them a little bit about where their food comes from.
But is it really giving people a realistic picture of agriculture?
Right. That's the question. Isn't it? I mean, is it just perpetuating this romanticized view that we were talking about earlier?
Like, is it actually educational or is it just entertainment?
Exactly. And I think the author is wrestling with that tension, this pull between the idealized version of rural life and the actual, messy, complicated reality.
Yeah, and he seems to be saying that those two things don't always line up.
Right. I mean, he clearly has this deep nostalgia for his childhood on the farm, but he also seems to recognize that, he's not that kid anymore.
He's an adult living in the city.
Exactly. And his priorities have changed.
Yeah.
His understanding of the world has changed.
And that's where he ends up, saying that he could never be happy living outside of a city.
Yeah, he actually makes this list of all the things he loves about city life. Museums, art galleries, sports stadiums, even a guaranteed secure food supply from Loblaws. Like he's making a case for the city. Right. He contrasts the richness and the connectedness of urban life with what he sees as the, isolation and disconnection of rural life.
But is that really true? I mean, is rural life always isolating?
That's a good question. And I think it goes back to this idea of disconnect that we keep coming back to. The author is viewing rural life through his own urban lens.
Right.
He's looking for a specific kind of experience, but he might be missing some of the nuances.
Like he's looking for a postcard version of the countryside.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that's not always the reality.
So how do we get past that? How do we move beyond these, romanticized views of rural life?
Well, I think the first step is acknowledging that those romanticized views exist.
Oh, okay.
We need to be aware of our own biases and assumptions and be willing to challenge them.
So it's about being more self-aware.
Yeah. And it's also about being open to listening to the stories and experiences of people who actually live and work in rural community.
Right. Like we need to get out of our urban bubbles.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We need to stop seeing rural America as this other place and start recognizing that it's intricately connected to our own lives.
Especially when it comes to something as basic as food.
Exactly. So maybe that's one of the biggest takeaways from this deep dive.
What do you mean?
It's a reminder that our perceptions of rural life are often shaped by, our own limited experiences. And those perceptions can prevent us from really understanding what's going on in these communities.
So it's about challenging our assumptions and being open to new perspectives.
Exactly.
And maybe even taking a step outside of our comfort zones.
I think that's a great way to put it.
It really does make you think, huh? And what's interesting is that the essay doesn't really give us any easy answers,
I know, right? Like there's no simple solution.
Yeah, it's more like it just raises a bunch of questions. And honestly, I kind of like that.
Me too.
Yeah.
It's not trying to preach or tell us what to think.
Yeah.
It's more like it's inviting us to grapple with the issue.
Yeah.
Right.
Like to think for ourselves. And one of the things that keeps coming back to me is that image of Scenic Acres being on the verge of closing.
Yeah, I thought about that too.
The author even mentions that the owner's kids are like these intransigent ghosts. They're there, but they don't seem to want anything to do with the farm.
It's like they represent the future, but they're not really present.
Exactly. And it made me wonder what will happen to places like Scenic Acres,
Right. Like, are they doomed to disappear?
Yeah. Will they get swallowed up by these big agricultural corporations?
Or will they find a way to adapt? I mean, some small farms are finding creative ways to stay afloat,
Like what kind of things?
Well, some are focusing on niche markets.
Yeah.
Like organic produce or artisanal cheese.
Okay.
Others are turning to agritourism, like we were talking about earlier.
Creating those experiences for city folks.
Exactly. And some are even getting into things like renewable energy.
Oh, wow.
So there's hope.
I think so. It's definitely a challenging time for small farms.
But there's also a lot of innovation and resilience out there.
So maybe it's not just about whether these farms survive, but how they survive.
Right. Like, what will the future of agriculture look like?
And what role will small farms play in that future?
Exactly. And I think those are questions that we all need to be thinking about.
Because it affects all of us, right? I mean, everyone eats.
That's true. We're all part of the food system, whether we realize it or not.
And our choices matter.
Absolutely. Every time we go to the grocery store, we're making a decision.
Right. Like, are we supporting small farms?
Are we prioritizing sustainability?
Are we thinking about the people who are growing our food?
It's all connected,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this essay really brought that home for me. It's not just about one farm or one author. It's about all of us.
I agree. And I think that's what makes it so powerful. It's a story that resonates on a much deeper level.
Yeah. It's about our relationship with the land, the people who work it, the choices we make.
And ultimately, it's about our responsibility, I think.
To be more informed.
To be more engaged.
To be more mindful of the impact we have on the world around us.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to sum it up.
So to our listeners out there, we encourage you to keep exploring these questions.
Yeah, don't be afraid to get your hands dirty.
Visit a local farm chat with the farmers at your farmer's market.
Really think about where your food comes from.
Because these are issues that affect all of us.
And we all have a role to play in creating a more just and sustainable food system.
Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's been a real pleasure.
Likewise. It's always great to have these conversations.
And until next time, keep on learning, keep on questioning, and keep on digging deeper.
See you next time.